There is nothing like an election to remind a politician of the full diversity of wildlife whom he is privileged to represent in his constituency. In the recent election, I canvassed a farmer in the Isle of Wight, and he was very pleased to meet a member of the European Parliament, and he told me this involved story. He'd purchased a seed bull, a very expensive pedigree animal, and apparently it just wouldn't do the business. He put it with all his heifers, it wouldn't serve any of them. And then on the internet, he had found this wonderful drug. And he stirred it in with the meal, and bingo, the bull couldn't get enough of it. All the heifers were in calf. He was absolutely delighted. And he was very alarmed to hear that the European Union might be about to prescribe this chemical. Well, I said, of course, I'll look into that for you, sir. What's it called? He said, well, I can't rightly remember its name, but I can tell you that it tastes of aniseed. And then I canvassed one house in a town called Woking that was answered by a small boy who must have been about 6 years old. He was wearing a great smoking jacket that was kind of hanging loosely from his shoulders. In one hand he had a balloon of brandy about the size of his little head that he was swirling around, and in the other, smouldering slowly ceilingwards, was what smelled like a very expensive Cuban cigar. Well, as you do when you're canvassing, I leaned down and I said, "Are your parents at home?" And he said, "Does it effing look as though my parents are at home?" Now, believe me, my friends, there is no one more Jeffersonian than I am about democracy. My whole life has been an attempt to apply his doctrines to British political conditions, but I bet you even your third president quite appreciated from time to time being in a room full of people who couldn't vote for him or couldn't vote against him. So it is a huge pleasure, particularly to be here at Cato. I'll tell you, Cato, the Marcus Porcius Catos, have played a big part in my life recently, because I was very inspired by the elder Cato. You probably know the story about him. He was a senator in the early Roman Republic, and he's best known because he got into the habit of ending all of his speeches, whatever the subject, with the phrase, "And Carthage must be destroyed, delenda est Carthago." And the other senators used to mock him. They used to mimic his voice. They used to shout him down, ignore him, but of course, in the end, they did what he asked. They sacked Carthage, they sowed the fields with salt. And about 4 years ago, when the European governments cancelled their promise of a referendum on the Constitution, I, inspired by the elder Cato, started doing the same thing. So I took advantage of a little-known procedure in the European Parliament whereby every member is allowed to speak for up to 60 seconds on the subject on which he's just voted. And after every vote, I would talk about whatever it was, Turkish accession, permissible noise of motors in motorbikes, whatever it was, and I would always finish with the phrase, "And the Lisbon Treaty must be put to a vote." In Latin, obviously. Pactio Olisipiensis, sensenda est, this being Cato the Elder. And I'm afraid I was much less successful than the Roman, because no one had a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty. In fact, instead, I was shut down. I was told by the president that although what I was doing might be technically within the rules, it was plainly against the spirit of the institution, and so he was presuming to the power arbitrarily not to take points of information from people who he thought were making a frivolous speech, thereby rather confirming the view of this organization as an arbitrary one. Of course, this institution takes its name indirectly not from that Cato, but from his great-grandson, also Marcus Porcius Cato. And those of you who are regulars at Cato will know the story, but forgive me if I briefly recap on it, David, just because it's germane to what I'm about to talk about this evening. Long before the Declaration of Independence, or the framing of the US Constitution, long before Lexington or Yorktown, long before Jefferson or Madison or Washington was born, two Englishmen were beginning to adumbrate the principles that eventually informed and defined this republic. And in their letters, they set out what we now think of as the ideals of the Founding Fathers, the idea that decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the people that they affect, that the individual should be as free as possible from state coercion, that office holders should be answerable through the ballot box. Their names were John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, and they used the pseudonym of Cato, the younger Cato, Cato's Letters, and it's from that text that this institute takes its name. And it worked. The seeds that they sent over a generation later to this part of the world, and that were then scattered in the rich humus of North America, bore fruit as your constitution, your polity, predicated on the principles that they had set out. And that constitution has done exactly what its framers wanted. Well, maybe not exactly, but it has done rather better than any other competitor in the world. It has served to keep the country free, the government under control. It has preserved individual liberty. It's ensured that democracy is diffused and dispersed. And it didn't only serve to make this country successful. The promise of that constitution also drove your fathers to carry the promise of freedom to other continents, which is why the world has a stake in the success of this republic. The remarkable thing, when you look as a foreigner, about the American dispensation is the way in which, if you like, the DNA encoded at the old courthouse in Philadelphia, the genotype, has formed the phenotype that we still recognize. Open primaries, states' rights, the election of public office holders from the school board to the sheriffs, the dispersal of power, referendums, balanced budget procedures, recall mechanisms, all of these things are part of that original Jeffersonian vision, or rather, as we now know, the original Cato the Younger vision of a republic where power would be diffused. And although, of course, it's imperfect, because man is fallen and perfection is not of this world, it has worked better than any rival. To see how unique your system is, allow me to compare it to what happens in other parts of the world. I can do no better in a way than to compare your constitution with that we have just adopted in the European Union. The US Constitution is 7,200 words long. I have a copy of it here, published by a Washington institute. Now, normally at this stage, my party trick is to bring out the European Constitution, but I actually couldn't bring it on the flight. I'd have gone over the weight limit. Ours is 78,000 words long. Yours is mainly concerned with the freedom of the individual. Ours is chiefly concerned with the power of the state. Your Declaration of Independence guarantees your right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The EU's equivalent, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms, guarantees our right to strike action, free healthcare, and affordable housing. But the real difference is in how the two documents were ratified. Your constitution came into effect following separate ratification in the 13 member states, or to be strictly accurate, in 11 of the member states, with North Carolina and Rhode Island falling into line shortly afterwards. The EU constitution, by contrast, was rejected repeatedly in referendums by 55% of French voters, by 62% of Dutch voters, by 54% of Irish voters, and then imposed anyway. Now, if you think that I am being absurd in drawing a comparison between your constitution and that of an association of states, let me refer you to the author of the European Constitution, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who made the comparison explicitly at the time. I was there in the drafting convention when he inaugurated it. And he said, "This is our Philadelphia moment." And he went on to compare himself to Jefferson. And where do you begin with criticizing that comparison? Why don't we start with this? Jefferson wasn't there. he was, as Giscard might have been expected to know, ambassador to Paris at the time and not present when the Constitution was being drafted. But the real absurdity in the comparison becomes clear when you look at the intention of the two documents. The one is about the dispersal of power, the exercise of decision-making at the lowest feasible level. The other is about the centralization of power. The opening line 1 of Article 1 of the EU's foundational treaty, commits the member states to an ever closer union. It's a kind of anti-Jeffersonianism. And from that basic design flaw have stemmed almost all the problems that the European Union has suffered since. Exactly as your third president would have predicted, as he indeed did predict. This is a private letter that Jefferson wrote in 1812. Think of how aptly this applies to the European Union. Our country is too large to have all its affairs directed by a single government. Public servants at such a distance, and from under the eye of their constituents, must, from the circumstances of distance, be unable to administer and overlook all the details necessary for the good government of the citizens. And the same circumstance, by rendering detection impossible to their constituents, will invite the public agents to corruption, plunder, and waste. Is there a better description of what happens in Brussels and of why it happens in Brussels? If government becomes remote, cut off from the people it purports to speak for, concentrated in the hands of an elite, then inevitably that elite will become self-serving. Well, I'm sure that you can guess where this argument is going. I'm in Washington for one day. I was in New York this morning. I'm flying back to London after this meeting. But I found time this morning, as I always do when I visit this town, to go to the Jefferson Memorial. And it's like that scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Every time I'm here, I goggle reverently at your third president. And this time, as I stood there, I fancied I heard a clanking noise. Surely the shade of your third president rattling his chains as he sees what is being done to the republic that he designed. Because exactly this European model is coming. Power is being centralized. The idea of the dispersal of power of states' rights is being gradually steamrolled. And instead of the direct election of decision makers, we have a new functionariat of federal czars. Czars, for heaven's sake! I mean, of all the things, having founded this country, having raised your hands against the Lord's anointed on the basis that you were all free, you have the most authoritarian model possible. And of course, it is going to serve to make the country less democratic and less free and less prosperous. Here's an amazing statistic. In 1974, the countries of, let's call it old Europe, the 15 member states of the EU as it stood prior to eastward expansion, to the enlargement of the former Comecon states, accounted for 36% of world GDP. Today, they account for 24%, and in 2020 they will account for 15% of the world's wealth. Over that same period, the share of world GDP occupied by the US has remained and will remain pretty steady. 26.3% in 1974, 26.7% projected in 10 years' time. And why is that? Why is it that the European model is serving to depreciate growth and competitiveness? Well, it's precisely because if you take away the pluralism, the diversity, the competition that comes from jurisdictions striving to outdo each other, you are bound to get a less competitive and less productive overall outcome. Put it like this. If you have tax harmonization, hands up who thinks that taxes will be harmonized downwards. Right? And there's a reason for that. External competition is the best constraint on a big government, a government wishing to extend its powers. You can raise your taxes up to a certain point, and then the money starts flowing into friendlier overseas jurisdictions. But if you can regulate to export your tax levels to everyone else, as is happening in the European Union, then that constraint is removed. You can give your employees the most generous entitlements. You can give them paternity leave and guaranteed vacations up to a certain point before the jobs, the factories, the enterprises start moving abroad. But if you have a way of spreading your costs, then you can get out of that straitjacket. And that broadly is the premise of the European Union. And it may, if I'm being very generous, it may arguably have made some sense in the 1950s when the main competition was coming from within one continent. But it makes absolutely no sense in the modern world when capital surges around the globe at the touch of a button and when the internet has eliminated distance. It's as easy for my constituents now to sell to a company in the US as it is to sell to a company just across the channel. In fact, it's easier for them to do business in the US because they share a language, they share a common law system, they share commercial practices and accountancy traditions. So the whole superstructure of European regulation supposedly done in the name of guaranteeing a functioning single market has not only created this corporatist state, but it has failed to guarantee the single market. It would have been better for there to have been no government intervention, just to have let businesses talk one to another. Why am I telling you this? Well, bit by bit, the US administration is going down our European road. If you look at the policies being pursued by your current rulers, they amount to a comprehensive strategy of Europeanization. They are not a series of random initiatives that have been lashed together accidentally. They all trend in the same direction. European healthcare, European welfare, European tax levels, European unemployment rates, of course, inevitably with that, European carbon taxes, European foreign policy, European disarmament. This is a sustained attempt to change the character of the Republic into something else. And let me tell you, my friends, I know what that something else is. I know better than most people, because I have been working in the European Parliament for 11 years now. I am living in your future. And believe me, you're not going to like it. Think of me as that guy in the H.G. Wells story who comes from the future and says, no, don't do it, there's still time, turn aside. That's me. Because yes, of course, in the short term, all sorts of European things are defensible. As I say, paternity leave and long vacations, what's not to like? But in the long term, reality imposes itself. And you can't carry on sustaining this level of what they call the European model, the old mixed capitalist system, in a world when the main competition is coming from China and India. Now, the founders, I think, knew what they were doing when they put Congress in Article 1 of your Constitution before the presidency. And of course, it's going to be up to you next month to decide whether to carry on in that direction. But be under no illusion about what the eventual destination will be. The US, if it carries on down this road, will become less American. And by less American, I mean less prosperous and less independent and less free. It will be more like the rest of the world, which of course will be your problem, but it will be our problem too. Why do I come and say these things as a British politician? Why do I come and laud the constitutional model that was born out of a revolt against the British Crown? I'm occasionally asked that question in Britain. Why are you trying to Americanize our system? Why do you want the sheriffs and the open primaries and all of these things? And my answer is, well, where do you think that the American founders got their inspiration from? They didn't just dream these things up in a vacuum while having tea one morning, because they still drank tea in those days. This was pre-1773. They were drawing on developed English constitutional theory and, more to the point, English constitutional practice. They were drawing on the Cato letters, which inspired the building that we're standing in now. The propositions that actuated the original Tea Partiers, the 1773 Tea Partiers, would have been cheerfully endorsed by the vast majority of people in Great Britain at the time. Taxes should not be raised without popular consent. The executive should be answerable to the legislature. People should be free of confiscatory or arbitrary confiscation. And there should be elected office holders rather than what in those days we called crown placemen. Nowadays in Britain we call quangocrats. In other words, appointed but unelected agents of the state. Which brings me to my country's present tragedy. The grievances that were laid against the British Crown by your patriot leaders 200 years ago turned out not to be true. Britain didn't develop into an autocracy. It carried on shifting towards a democratic system. But they are coming true today. As we have handed power to the European Union and as we have shifted power from elected representatives to unelected functionaries, the fears that actuated the revolutionary leaders are belatedly being realized. How aptly we could apply the phrases from your Declaration of Independence to our current constitutional dispensation. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. What a perfect description of the growth of bureaucracy in contemporary Europe. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and unacknowledged by our laws. What a perfect description of the European constitution imposed on us, despite all three parties promising us a referendum that they then failed to deliver. So you can imagine, my friends, how I feel as a British patriot, brought up in that tradition, seeing in this part of the world liberties thriving that are withering in the ancestral country, when I see those same freedoms being abandoned here. It's a bit like, there were those varieties of grape that were exported to California, and then they only survived in California when phylloxera wiped out the ancestral vines in Europe. In a similar way, I look at the institutions of the US and I think here is one place where British freedoms are surviving in a way that would have been understood by those Homeric figures of the British Parliament in the 18th century. But if you give up on them, then truly the world will be a darker and quieter place. There is still an alternative. We can still create a bond of free peoples dedicated to democracy, to independence, and to the control of our governments. You are extraordinarily fortunate to have a system that puts you in the driving seat. I was asked by a British journalist this afternoon, why is there no British Tea Party? Is it because all these kooky Americans have this peculiar obsession with low taxes? And I said, well, it's because they have open primaries. And there was a poll by the World Service, the BBC World Service, on Sunday. In 22 countries, people were asked, should the deficit be closed by higher taxes or by lower spending? In 21 of the 22 countries, people overwhelmingly said, by lower spending. Right? So the US is in line with not just Britain, but Brazil and Pakistan and everyone else. Egypt was the only exception. They were the only ones who wanted more taxes. Now, why then is there this peculiar phenomenon here? Because people have not been habituated to being ignored. You still have a political system where the candidates are chosen by the country at large rather than being imposed by party leaderships. And therefore, people still have a belief, with all its imperfections, that elections matter and that they can change the destiny of the country by casting their ballots. I'm afraid that sense, more than any of the others, is the one that has withered in Europe as a result of European integration and the decaffeination of the voting, the act of voting, the disempowerment of our parliaments. If we had open primaries, we'd have all sorts of good ideas coming in the United Kingdom. But if you give up on them here, if you give up on the model which its opponents call populism, but which I think of as democracy, i.e. doing what people want, a politician reflecting the opinion of his constituents, shock horror, then truly all of us will have lost something. So I'd like to leave time for questions, but let me end with a heartfelt imprecation from a British conservative who loves his country to Americans who still believe in theirs. Honour the vision of your founders. Respect the most sublime constitution devised by human intelligence. Never be afraid to speak to and for the soul of this nation, of which, by good fortune and God's grace, you are privileged to be part.